Hello, all you resolute rhinoceroses out there. Welcome to another episode of A Little Greener, a podcast all about conservation, nature, and sustainability. I am one of your hosts, Casey, and I'm joined by the wonderful Sarah. Hello, Sarah.
Hello, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Happy 2023, which does not feel like a real year.
Nah, totally fake, for sure. But we made it, so that's cool.
We did make it, yep.
How are you doing? How's your New Year's?
It's fine. You know, I feel like I saw so many like jokes about how that time between Christmas and New Year is like not really a time and you never know what day it is, or you know how it feels like it's been forever, and also Christmas was yesterday and blah blah. I've never really felt that before. I think it because I don't like have any time off work and I don't have any kids that are off of school or anything like that. But I did still somehow really feel that this year. I feel like at the end of last year, I just sort of had no idea what was happening or what day it was or when the holidays were. And I feel like that has continued over into the new year. And I just feel like I'm totally like my work week, I just felt all messed up this week. Like I thought that today is my quote unquote Friday, and I felt like it was all day yesterday. I just sort of don't know what's going on. So, confused is how I've started my new year.
You know what? I think that's an okay way to start your new year. For me, because at my job, we start setting it for Christmas in August, and then we're in like full Christmas mode from like November into December. Like 2 days after Christmas, when we started doing our big Christmas sale, my coworker was like, enough, and like took down all of the Christmas stuff that was behind the register. And I mean, it's not at this point, because we have like we live in Christmas.
So long,
yeah, for like, you know, your 40 something hours a week in aggressive Christmas. And she's like, nope, it's spring behind the counter and we're gonna buff the floors and we're gonna get ready for the new year. And honestly, it felt like that's about as close to like a refresh
well, there you go.
that could be achieved. So yeah, I did not stay up till midnight.
Heck no.
Yep, I am just not that part. Or normally we do if we are with my cousins, but we had COVID issues and stuff. And so really COVID has ruined the last 3 New Year's that we've had. And so at this point, I haven't stayed up past midnight for a couple years. We don't have cable. We don't watch the ball drop or anything.
No, yeah, I don't have any interest in the ball drop stuff anymore. And I have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. So
yep, not worth.
There was no staying up till midnight. But I do enjoy the concept of New Year and the fresh start.
Me too.
And all of that. So that's good. We'll have to discuss that at, you know, some future episode. I almost put that as our question for today, to talk about our environmental New Year's resolutions, but I did not. So we'll save that for an episode where we talk more in depth about that. My question for you this week, Casey, feels kind of random, but it actually is something that I'm just curious about for you. We're going to talk today about something that made the news recently towards the tail end of 2022. And so I'm just curious for you, like I sort of came across this by happenstance, sort of passively, which is how I feel like I get my news all too often now. So I'm curious for you, how do you stay up to date, or where do you learn about your environmental conservation news, stories, information? How do you feel like you keep yourself up to date? Because, you know, I always feel like you have a lot of knowledge about things, and I'm just curious, like what your procedures are, or what your favorite resources are, or how you do that.
So when I work directly in the field, I every morning would specifically read environmental news, and I was on mangabay.com, which is a really great environmental news source. You should check them out if you haven't before. It's really great. And then E360 Yale is another one. And like every day I was at work, I would start my morning by checking my email and then checking to see if there were any breaking stories on there, because I was about to go talk to the public about the environment, and I like to stay up to date. Since then, because I don't have that routine, And frankly, sometimes when you overload yourself with environmental news, you get real sad. So I kind of broke that habit. At this point, I would say that my news algorithm knows me well enough that it does try and get me my environmental stories, at least the big ones. And then my social media is a lot of, I follow Manga Bay, and then I follow a couple other different environmental groups or people who I admire in the field. And then, frankly, a lot of my friends are also in the field. And so I am able to get news stories through them as well. So I don't feel like I'm well-rounded and like actively in the know anymore, but I do feel like I am probably more well-rounded than the average American.
Sure. And I suppose I probably am too. It sounds like maybe we're relatively similar right now in the way that we do it, because that is what I feel. I sort of just rely on what pops up when I open my Google News feed or whatever. I think maybe I just search too many other things. Like, so I have a lot of sports stories that will pop up on mine, and a certain sect of entertainment news, like Broadway stories will pop up on my Google feed in addition to the environmental things. But I do definitely rely on that, just my technological devices spying on me at this point, and following organizations on social media. But then I'm sort of dependent on what those algorithms choose to show me as well. So I like the idea of maybe just sort of doing that same thing, but also being a little more intentional and maybe making it part of my routine, if not every day, a couple of times a week at least, to have some dedicated sites that I go to and actively seek out. So maybe I'll have to incorporate that into my routine in the new year. But the particular news story that we're going to talk about today is one of those things that just popped up on my newsfeed, as I imagine it did for a lot of people. And we mentioned it last week. I hope your cousin, hello, Ben, I hope that you enjoy this episode. We are going to be talking a little bit about nuclear fusion. And nuclear fusion made some headlines a couple weeks ago regarding the first time that we've gotten more energy out of a fusion reaction than we've put in. I didn't really understand what that meant or why it's such a big deal. So that's what we're going to be talking about this evening. Stick around for that discussion. All right. Welcome, everybody, to yet another discussion that feels very intimidating to me as someone who was never particularly fond of physics or chemistry or that side of the sciences. Give me your biology and anatomy and all that fun stuff any day of the week. This is sort of like another language to me. But we are going to talk about nuclear fusion. I think of this as like a bonus episode to our energy series. So nobody is getting any power. We're not getting any electricity from nuclear fusion, except for very indirectly. Nuclear fusion is what is going on in the sun all the time. So I guess sort of indirectly, we're getting all of our power from nuclear fusion.
None and all
at the same time. So this isn't, we're not going to look at this exactly like we do the other things in our energy series. I can't go super in depth into things like how nuclear fusion as an energy source is going to impact the environment. We will talk a little bit about that, but the fact is we just don't know because it's not happening yet. So we're going to talk about where we're at in all of that, and also talk a little bit about this news story that broke recently and what the big deal with that is. In order to do that and get into that and try to understand why we even care about nuclear fusion as a potential future source for electricity, I do want to go back to our episode that I poorly titled Nuclear Power. I should have titled it specifically Nuclear Fission. So let's do a quick recap of nuclear fission. Fission is generating heat by splitting atoms. So we're splitting an atom into smaller pieces, smaller nuclei, and other subatomic particles. Basically, fission becomes a chain reaction. It's an emission-free source of energy in that production of energy. Energy is released by splitting the nucleus into smaller pieces. That sort of makes sense in my brain. Like, I can understand splitting something up, releasing energy. So that's what fission is. Casey, do you remember what we talked about as far as some of the drawbacks of nuclear fission, or what your thoughts were, some of the things that you weren't maybe feeling so great about with regards to fission?
Sure. So you've already sort of talked about the pro, which is that it's basically doesn't produce any carbon emissions during the process of creating energy. Mm-hmm. Again, to be super clear, nuclear fission is if you have a nuclear power plant near you right now, it uses fission. Right. Nobody's using fusion. It's all fission. Obviously, from a public perception standpoint, nuclear disasters are always, I think, the first thing, because when you think of nuclear, you could think of nuclear power plant, you could think of nuclear bomb, and they don't feel super far apart, even though they are. Really, like, my issues is storage of the nuclear waste, because there is radioactive waste that remains. And right now, our sort of idea is keep it in a medium-term storage facility. No one really wants responsibility for it long-term. And I don't think humans have a great track record with things that we have no actual plan for.
Right.
So that's definitely an issue for me. And then we did talk a little bit about the environmental impacts of uranium mining, because you do have to have a particular fuel source. And while it seems like they have improved a lot of the methods for this, mining operations still have lots of impacts on the environment. So that's like the drawbacks environmental safety wise.
Yeah, I still have questions about uranium mining, even though that has changed over the years. It has a not great history as well, which is something to consider. We've had some nuclear disasters, some meltdowns or partial meltdowns at various nuclear power plants around the world. And while some people might make the argument that those actually could have been a lot worse, that doesn't change the fact that they were still nuclear disasters. And that's going to be a hard thing. That is a hard thing for me to sweep aside. So there is that potential for things to really go wrong in these reactors. These, like I said, these are chain reactions. So if something goes wrong, things can, like, literally what will happen is this reaction overheats and the things literally melt. And then things that we don't want to be escaping that reactor can escape that reactor. So we don't want that to happen. And there's that public perception of that to get over as well. And then, yeah, you mentioned some, not all, but some of the radioactive waste generated from these plants is going to be radioactive for thousands of years. And the United States has still no long-term storage facility. It just blows my mind that we just don't have one. So that's big. We also mentioned cost of facilities and that sort of thing being a factor.
That's the practical reason why we don't have more of them. They are actually more commonly built in the Eastern Hemisphere. Like, they're an industry that keeps being built, but they often in the US, because we sort of don't have a knowledge chain and we don't do it very often, they end up costing lots and lots of money. So while it might be, it takes a really long time for them to also to recoup all their costs as well. So while it might be a really great idea for a carbonless way of producing energy, whether the sun's out, whether the wind's blowing, the startup cost is pretty prohibitive to most places.
And it is something that, of course, they're trying to work on with new technology as well. But the fact remains that there are some drawbacks or considerations to keep in mind with fission. So are there other alternatives here? Let's look at nuclear fusion as an energy source. This has some of the same pros as fission in terms of it being a process that will not generate carbon emissions during the actual production of energy. And we'll talk about how it might relate to some of those drawbacks of nuclear fission as we go along. What the heck is nuclear fusion? I'm going to say these things backwards so many times tonight. But as the name would imply, fusion is putting two things together. So nuclear fusion is basically smashing two lightweight nuclei together to make one nucleus of a smaller total mass than the two originals put together. Does that make sense? So you're smashing two things together, and the product is actually smaller than the product of the two whole things were initially, which sort of already just doesn't make sense in my brain. But basically, that's going to end up releasing some energy. If you think back to that lovely equation that we all learned many years ago, E equals mc squared, one of the things that means basically is that mass can be converted into energy. And C is a really, really large number. So even small differences in that mass can lead to big differences in energy. So that's what we're doing. It's sort of the opposite process of fission, and it confuses me sometimes that both of those things release energy, but they do. So that's what we're talking about with fusion. This only works with smaller, lighter nuclei. So for heavier nuclei, it's iron 56. Anything smaller than that, you can do fusion reactions with. Anything larger, you're going to have to put more energy into that reaction than you would be able to get out. So that's not very helpful to us. How does this happen? You have to have really high temperatures and really close conditions for nuclear fusion to occur. So basically, you're having to overcome repelling forces of two positively charged nuclei. So we remember that those things of the same charge are going to push away from each other. We think about opposites attract. So those same positive forces are going to try to repel each other. But once you get them close enough, if you overcome that repelling force, once you get them close enough, there are going to be stronger attracting forces, basically, that smash them together. So the sun has the advantage of being very large and having a strong gravitational pull that basically allows this to happen naturally. So hydrogen is just fusing all over the place with the sun. To make this happen on Earth, we have to heat plasma hotter than the sun. Think over 100 million degrees Celsius, like up to around 150 million degrees Celsius. We have to heat this plasma to get these nuclei to join together, and we have to keep it all confined in a certain space to keep them close enough to get this reaction to occur. So the fact that people ever thought that this would be something that is possible to do on Earth is amazing to me in and of itself. In addition to maybe not having some of those negative impacts that fission potentially has, this also has the potential to release more energy than fission does. So it's possible that fusion can generate 4 times more energy per kilogram of fuel than fission does, and nearly 4 million times more energy than burning coal or oil. So far we've got emission-free and a potentially really efficient energy source as two positives that we're looking at with nuclear fusion. So let's kind of take a look at the history and the timeline of what's been going on with thinking about fusion as an energy source. There are nuclear fusion projects going on in over 50 countries around the world. And this concept has been understood since the 1930s. And the first fusion reaction was produced in a lab in 1934.
So this just reminds me that our chemistry and physics classes, at least when I was in school, were so below the level of what these scientists are operating at. Like, I remember when we went from like, this is the diagram of the atom and all the electrons go in these little circles. And then like some point in high school, they were like, JK, they're a cloud. And you're like, whoa, hold on.
Right. Yeah. We were talking about that before.
Yeah,
like, I'm like, it's too late. Like, I can't
do that.
I can no longer comprehend that because you've showed me all of these little drawings of the electrons.
And then at some point they were like, hey, remember that time we told you that like atoms are the smallest thing? That also wasn't really true. There's subatomic particles that are like even smaller than neutrons and protons and electrons. Like, there's all sorts of things going on here, and just take our word for it. It's happening, but it's not really going to impact. And so that's when I think we get into this fusion conversation that a lot of us don't really have the vocabulary for conceptualizing where it is, where like a lot of these other things is like the sun, I light it on fire. The wind.
Casey, is this your way of telling me that I did a really poor job explaining?
No, not at all. I actually think you did a really great job explaining. I just think that like, even when you do a good job explaining, the actual mechanism can be really hard to picture, because energy, first of all, is not something that you can picture really easily. It's normally like some squiggly line on a graph being like energy. But just all the things going on with this are just so different than our traditional ways of getting energy that I think for the general population, it feels science fiction, even though it's not.
It feels science fiction. And reading about all of this, and I had moments of clarity where like, I feel like I get it, and then I would lose it. But it's hard, even just because we're not doing it yet, or different places are trying to do different things. There's not like I could look up with nuclear fission, I could find pictures and diagrams of what a nuclear reactor looks like and how it works and what all the parts are. You can't even really do that for nuclear fusion yet. So not only am I trying to just sort of mentally grasp this concept of the subatomic particles and trying to remember those things that I learned in physics and chemistry, like trying to do it without as nearly as much like concrete visual information is quite the challenge. But it is really interesting. And as usual, we'll have lots of links that you can check out in the show notes too, if you want to try to sort of grasp this concept a little bit more. So it's incredible to me that for as hard as it is for me to understand this now, that this is something that has been looked at since the 1930s. There was a big breakthrough in 1968 in the Soviet Union. Researchers, they were able to achieve temperature levels and plasma confinement time. Remember, those are two important things. We need this to be really hot, and we need it to be closely contained, that had never been attained before. So they used a machine that it's described as a donut-shaped magnetic confinement device. I do not know how to pronounce this word. Tokamak?
That's what it looks like to me. Yeah.
Tokamak. And this is probably the forefront design that it seems like scientists are still thinking would be used in the production of commercially available energy for fusion reactions. So keep that word in mind, however you pronounce it. And then the Joint European Torus, or JET, J-E-T, in the UK, which has been in operation since 1983, achieved the world's first controlled release of fusion power in 1991. The Tor Supra Tokamak, I'm going to pronounce it differently every time, in France, holds the record for the longest plasma duration time of any tokamak, which is 6 minutes and 30 seconds. The Japanese JT60 achieved the highest value of fusion triple product, is what they call it, which is density, temperature, and confinement time of any device. And then our most recent big breakthrough came on December 5th, 2022, when a team at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory's National Ignition Facility, referred to as NIF. I learned that there's a lot of acronyms in nuclear fusion. They conducted the first controlled fusion experiment in history to produce more energy from fusion than what was put into the reaction. So they got a positive amount of energy from the reaction. Previously, when we've gotten fusion to take place, it has required more energy input into the reaction than we were able to get out, which is obviously not helpful if we're trying to generate electricity. So I feel like, though, Casey, I don't know what your thought was when you saw these headlines. And of course, we're practicing reading the actual articles and not just reading the headlines. But it's not quite what it might sound like initially if you just hear that and just read that headline, that they got more out of the reaction than they put in. So if you dig a little deeper into what actually happened. So first of all, this the National Ignition Facility, it's not one of the tokamaks. It's a different type of setup. So they actually use laser-based inertial confinement. And what they did was it was 2.05 megajoules of energy delivered via laser pulses to this little fuel pellet that resulted in 3.15 megajoules of energy out. Great, cool, not a huge amount of energy difference, but still definitely positive. However, that's literally just if you're looking at the actual energy put in, like supplied to the fuel, if you will. To run those lasers that delivered that energy to the fuel cell, it took about 322 megajoules.
Oh.
So it doesn't mean that they could have powered the lasers or powered the facility on the energy that they get out. So that's maybe misconception number one.
Okay. Well, okay. I do want to say that I do think it actually is. I mean, if you look at the integer difference between 2.05 and 3.15 megajoules, like that's not very big, but it is like 1.5 times the energy. So like on a larger scale, that might be exciting. Now, maybe you know this or maybe you don't, but like the lasers that went into this fusion, would they be able to do more fuel than that little experiment? Or is that literally like, that's what those lasers are designed to do, max them out, that pellet?
I don't fully know the answer to that.
Okay.
I do think that there is, I mean, they would have to up the scale
right
of this. And part of the reason I can't answer that fully is it's just literally not what any of these facilities are set up to do. Okay. None of them are set up in the way that anybody thinks would be usable in terms of mass production of energy. Like, we're not just going to hook any of these things up to the grid. They are all sort of testing different aspects of fusion, which is kind of cool, really. So they're trying to figure out what works best. So this laser-based inertial confinement could be used potentially in the future to generate electricity, but I don't think it is the leading. Like, most people who are studying this don't feel like lasers are necessarily going to be the way that it's done. I have read that much, at least. Again, it's another thing. Like, I don't fully understand. So here's what one article from nature.com, how they described it. They said that the NIF used its set of 192 lasers to deliver 2.05 megajoules of energy onto a pea-sized gold cylinder containing a frozen pellet of the hydrogen isotopes deuterium and tritium. The laser's pulse of energy caused the capsule to collapse, reaching temperatures only seen in stars and thermonuclear weapons. And the hydrogen isotopes fused into helium, releasing additional energy and creating a cascade of fusion reactions. That's how they describe it. I have a very clear but possibly wildly inaccurate mental image of these just science fiction lasers all just trained on this little tiny thing. I have no idea what that setup actually looks like. But that was the most sort of descriptive thing that I could find on what actually went down. So I have to say, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I'm glad that it's hydrogen from a selfish standpoint of understanding this, because hydrogen has like the one proton, I think, and then when you put two of them together, then it's going to go up to helium, right?
Yes. However, we are talking hydrogen isotopes here, so that's this deuterium and tritium, which we'll talk about as well. Because so the sun is super cool and just can do it with regular old hydrogen, but we cannot. We can't do that here. So we use there are different, and man, you can find like lists of the different possible fuels that could be used in fusion, but the scientific fusion community seems to feel that this combination of deuterium, I probably said that like 3 different ways as well, I'm pretty sure it's deuterium, and tritium are the most efficient combination to make this happen. And there's a whole set of like requirements that these fuels need to have. We talked a little bit about the size, but other things as well. But they feel that this is going to give the highest energy output at the comparatively lowest temperatures. So that's why these 2 things, I think, seem to be the leading fuel sources right now. Deuterium is also apparently abundant and so easy to get. Tritium, however, this isotope is very rare on Earth. It is like only found in trace amounts naturally in the atmosphere, so it's not something that we can like collect. So right now, commercially on Earth, they say there's only about 25 kilograms of tritium available. So I'm like, why are we even talking about this as a potential fuel source? But apparently it is, in some circumstances, a byproduct of nuclear fission. Only certain reactors, I think in Canada, actually, are the ones that produce this from their nuclear reactors right now. So that's where some of this comes from. But the hope and the thought, and I think one of the things that is going to be tested in these nuclear fusion sites around the world, is that we will be able to generate more tritium in fusion reactors. And again, because I don't really understand the design of these different types of setups for fusion, I don't fully understand how this works, but basically using a lithium blanket, and this tritium can be produced by, I think, some of these subatomic particles reacting with the lithium blanket in these fusion setups. But I think that this is just theoretical right now. Like, I'm not all sure that it's actually being put into practice.
All these fusion facilities around the world, like all 50 of them, are like, let's divvy up the existing tritium that we know about.
You have to buy it.
Guys, okay, all right.
And I guess you can do a lot with a small amount, as we see from our pea-sized fuel cell. It's all confusing. It's like it is a whole new world.
Like unobtainium from Avatar, or something like that. We're like, meh.
Yep. But that's what it is. There you go. So basically, you're taking these 2 different isotopes of hydrogen, you're smashing them together to create helium and your free neutrons and releasing energy in the process.
So then does the helium combine again, or is this just because there's so many atoms going on that it's pretty...
Once again, this is another thing that I don't quite understand, because I think it has to do with, like, we haven't sustained this for very long.
Okay.
Yet. So I think that's part of it. I know, like, in the sun, like, yes, there's basically just parts of the sun where there's just lots more helium now, I guess, than there used to be. But the sun is very, 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 very large. So there's still plenty of hydrogen going on up there too. So, okay, let's talk. We talked about a couple of the benefits of fusion just from talking about how it works there. But let's talk about a couple of the other potential benefits of fusion that address some of those drawbacks of fission. So we talk about the long-term high-level nuclear waste storage issue, that there is high-level waste produced from fission that is going to be radioactive for thousands of years. We have a storage problem with that. So tritium is radioactive. There are radioactive waste products produced with fusion. However, the half-life of tritium is only, I think it's actually a little bit less than 12 and a half years. So it negates the need for that long-term storage. It is going to decay much, much faster than those high-level wastes from fission. And so it's safer in that regard. The other thing is, and again, this is fuzzy in my brain, but we talk about fission being that chain reaction. It generates a lot of heat. It requires a coolant in the reactors. If something is disrupting that cooling process, if a reactor gets shut down, fission reactions don't stop immediately. And so if there's issues with that cooling, that's where we can get into some of those bigger disasters. Fusion, as we've kind of talked about, is difficult to maintain because you have to heat it to those extremely high temperatures and keep things contained in specific places. So if something disrupts the fusion process, it's done immediately. So there's no risk of a meltdown or anything like that. Everything is just going to stop immediately, is basically the gist of it as far as I understand. So in terms of a nuclear fusion reactor meltdown, it is literally physically not possible, is what it sounds like. So I like that one.
Yeah, that one's nice. I feel like as someone who lives near a nuclear power plant, weirdly, I'm less worried about the nuclear disaster than you.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it last time. I'm like convinced that probably we're going to do some fission to move forward towards our goals. Now, if fusion becomes an actual scalable deal, then maybe that negates too much long-term investment in fission. But also, you're talking about like such small experimental processes that scalability just seems like I was telling my dad that I had heard like we're like 30 to 40 years out from scalability. My dad's like, oh no, I heard someone said more like 10. And I was like, I have no idea.
I have no idea either. I'm sorry to tell you that even reading about this, I'm not sure. I did read some articles where some scientists were saying that, yes, they think maybe we're within 2 decades now, potentially. For me, reading about this, that feels hugely optimistic. Yeah. Like, I can't imagine this being ready to go that quickly. But who knows, now that this breakthrough has hit the news, what that will kind of spur on. So with that, where are we going from here? So these experiments are going to continue. NIF that just had this breakthrough, they're not even set up. Like, their goal is not even research for energy production. They're weapons research, which is a potential. I mean, there is still, like, I think we mentioned in our other nuclear energy episode that, I mean, fusion is the process used in H-bombs. Like, we didn't talk about that much, but there is still some of that concern that as we progress with nuclear fusion, that there could be more weapons issues. I don't know. That's kind of a separate, I'm compartmentalizing that for now.
Sure.
I think. But so more experiments are going to continue. We'll see if this happening, whether NIF will continue down that route, or if maybe funding will start to pivot more now towards this idea of cleaner energy. So we'll see how that goes. But there are other sites currently running, and a big one that will come up if you look up anything about nuclear fusion at this point is ITER. My understanding is that this started as an acronym for the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, but now they're just calling it, I don't know if they're saying ITER or if they're saying ITER, which apparently means the way in Latin. So there you go, ITER. And this is a joint project between China, the European Union, apparently still including the UK as well, India, Japan, Korea, Russia, and the United States. That has been in production.
Can work together.
We can. It's been in production for several years already in terms of construction. And it's not actually set to even turn on what they call first plasma until 2025. But we talked about how, some of these sites are researching specific things. So they have a website. You can visit iter.org and you can find a whole bunch of information. They talk about, so this is another one of those tokamaks. So they talk a little bit more about what that is. They talk about the timeline, and they talk about some of their goals for this particular project. So they are really going to be looking at, they have several things listed. So they're looking at things with the plasma. They're also using this deuterium, tritium plasma for fuel. And they're trying to look at getting this sustained internally, basically, by the fusion reactions supplying the heat for the reactions, I guess. They're looking at the tritium breeding that we mentioned. That's going to be one of the things that they are going to be looking at to see if they can figure out how to use those like blankets to produce more tritium is going to be one of the things. But they have like 5 specific areas, I guess, that ITER is going to be looking at. So that's a big project that's going to be coming online in the next couple of years. And private investment now of nuclear fusion has reached up to about $5 billion being invested into research. And again, we'll see what the latest development, if that spurns more. So it's, I guess, possible that interest from this will sort of jumpstart and will start to pick up steam a little more. But even just going back to some of those earlier breakthroughs, it's like, oh, we did this first in the 30s, and then 30 years later, we achieve another breakthrough. So I don't know. It'll be really interesting to see what happens. Do you have thoughts or feelings about any of this, Casey? Were you excited? Were you disappointed when you found out what it really meant? Or do you feel like it is not worth the time and the investment? Like, should we be spending our time on other more proven technologies at this point?
I have 2 parts of me that feel slightly differently. So, like, regarding the actual technological breakthrough, I think that it's exciting, and it's like the science nerd part of me is like, humans are cool.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we're trying to do something the sun does. How amazing that we would be able to accomplish even a fraction of what that is. That, I think that's super cool. I think that the implications long term for the use and scalability of this technology could be really, really amazing. The part of me that is a wet blanket is the one who has heard for too long that technology will save us.
Mm-hmm.
And that is my general concern, is that people who are already reticent to adopt already existing alternatives to fossil fuels, for example, will continue to use things like these to have an excuse of why we don't need to adopt renewable energies right now, because the next big solution is coming along the way. And I do think that, like, long-term technology will allow us to mitigate lots of parts of climate change. I just think that a lot of times we separate ourselves from that like in between time of all of the casualties on the in between of like all the people who are being impacted by climate change now, all the species that will lose, all the ecosystems that are going to be changed. We might end up coming to a future, that's a big bet, where our technology allows us to put the planet more back in balance. But in the meantime, like, why would we want to live in that world when things like solar and wind and other carbonless forms of technology exist, are scalable, are cheaper, and can be implemented right now, and yet we have such strong opposition from them that prevent them from being operable? Sure. That's my wet blanket frustration part of things like this. And also things like, I'm glad $5 billion is going into science, but also like, how much funding does the environment need right now? How, like, are these same people who can give $5 billion to nuclear do something that can actually make a difference right now in people's lives or animals' lives or the environment?
I hear you. And I think I went on a roller coaster with this, man, because at first I was like, oh, this is so cool. And then I was like, bah, this is not what I thought it was. And then what really got me oddly was, or I don't know if it's oddly, but was reading the actual, like from the NIF itself, specifically some of the people who worked on the team who made this happen. And then I sort of put myself in their shoes. They've been trying to do this for a long time. I don't want to get it wrong now, but I want to say that the facility opened in 2000, is either 2009 or 2012, I feel like, somewhere in that vicinity. Anyway, they actually thought that this was going to happen a lot sooner than it did. So I just feel really proud, I guess, of the scientists that figured this out. And I do feel that there is value in learning and progressing in what is nuclear fusion going to be a super important development that we all come to rely on? I don't know, but I think there's value in just learning and growing and figuring out what we can do and that sort of thing. So I just sort of put myself in their shoes for a minute and thought, you know what? Okay, yes, we're not, in my opinion, anywhere close to using this as an energy source yet, but dang, that's pretty cool and good for them for how much time and, thought and hard work went into this. And then I am sort of two minds. I totally get it. Like, we need to be better about utilizing the things that we have available to us today. But currently, as we sit here and talk about this, I'm really excited about nuclear fusion. Like, I hope it works. Like, I hope we can use this someday, because I do think that there are pros and cons to all energy types. I think there are some specific pros of nuclear energy that I really like as compared to some of the other types that we have available, but I just can't get over the safety cons, and that's both the mining and the reactor issues. And so in my mind right now, fusion is the coolest one in terms of all of the positives that it has and the amount of energy that it could produce, and negating some of those things that I don't like about fission. And so in my head, it's so fantastic. The problem is that it really is only in my head right now. So I don't know. I guess that was a long-winded way of just saying that I think it's really cool, and I know that we need to be investing in things right now, but I do think that there is also space to continue investing in these things to come. And I'm excited about it. It was fun to learn about.
I think I want it to work. I just don't want us to bank on it working. I think that's where I'm at.
Totally agree. And I do feel like this is a little bit different than things where I read about like carbon capture is going to save us and like stuff like that. To me, this is different. But I can see how some people might treat it the same as, oh, fusion is coming, so who cares about any of this other stuff? To me, it's not like that and shouldn't be treated as such, I think. But I think it could be an important player, an important piece of the puzzle down the line. And we also need to keep moving forward with the things that we have right now.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah. I learned a lot of things.
I hope so. I don't know. But yes, we'll have some links for you available in the notes, and we will wrap things up in just a moment. So stick around. All right, welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our discussion on nuclear fusion. I hope you enjoyed it. A couple of quick challenges for you this evening, sort of going back to what we talked about at the beginning, thinking about our news sources, how we stay up to date on what's going on in the environment and conservation and sustainability. I will challenge you to come up with your own conservation news plan, whether that means finding a website that you want to visit a couple of times a week that aggregates stories for you, whether you want to set a news alert for yourself with certain keywords, whether there is a particular organization or something like that that you want to start following to help keep you updated. I would just encourage you to come up with a plan for your new year of how you want to get a little more invested and make your news feed a little greener, I guess, for 2023. So think about that. I will also encourage you to visit this website for the ITER. Again, lots of links in the show notes, but I think that one in particular just has a whole lot of information. It has some basics on what nuclear fusion is, in addition to the project itself. So I think that might be a good source if you want just a little more clarity on some of the things that we've been talking about tonight. Casey, anything to add before we close it out?
Only that I won't hope that you don't feel weird about how you pronounce tokamak, because apparently it is an acronym from Russia. So
it's an acronym?
It's an acronym.
I knew it was a Russian thing.
It's a toroidal chamber with magnetic coils. So that's it comes from a Russian acronym. So
I feel weird about how I pronounced a lot of things tonight. but
well, not that one, because it is an acronym.
I won't lose any sleep over it. Y'all can if anybody out there listening works in nuclear fusion, if you're an engineer or a physicist or whoever, and you want to send some clarifying comments our way, feel free to do so. You can find us all over the place. We're on Facebook, A Little Greener Podcast. We're on Instagram at A Little Greener Pod. We're on Twitter at A Greener Podcast. You can email us at alittlegreenerpodcast@gmail.com for your pronunciation information, nuclear fusion clarifications, other ideas, questions, comments, things you want to hear about this year on the podcast, just to say hi, whatever. We're always happy to hear from you.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Thanks, Sarah, for getting us through a toughie. You're welcome, Ben.
Hope you enjoyed it.
We'll talk to you guys next week.
Bye.